One of the best and easiest places to start when we're talking about virtual SAN is to start with what's new. We've all been relatively familiar with it for about the past year, given the fact that, we saw it come out of beta. Everybody was so excited when, it was originally just thought to be 8 nodes inside of a cluster, and that was really going to change the world. And then we saw it GA to 32 to match what was happening inside of vSphere 5.5. And then with the release and announcement of vSphere 6, we're seeing it grow to up to 64 nodes in a cluster. And I think this is a really important distinction to remember when you're talking about VMware technology, is the fact that we're looking at the cluster, and that a cluster really isn't just a collection of machinery. A cluster is a cohesive unit that operates inside of the data center. At that cluster level, we're dealing with all of those cool kernel-based technologies that are so foundational and have transformed the data center that VMware lives in. Everything from high availability, DRS, fault tolerance, and also VSAN. So when we talk about scale, we're not just talking about more servers. We're talking about scaling out all of this functionality too, which I believe is a really important distinction for us to start with. If we look, we can see too that virtual SAN is growing up. No more is it just a niche workload type of player. It was very easy at the beginning to kind of dismiss virtual SAN as just for VDI or just for test and dev workloads. But now we're seeing that with the advent of all of the new adoptions of technologies, the ability to clone, the ability to create additional snapshots down at the storage level, things we'll talk about here in a few minutes, that we're seeing it grow up inside of this space all the way into business critical workload capabilities. So really the core message when we're talking about what's new with virtual SAN is in how it's grown. So what's changed to allow it to grow this way? Well, if we take a look here at what's grown and what's changed, we now have that support for business critical applications. We have increased density and increased scalability given all the stuff that's bubbled into vSAN from vSphere 6. And we also have a whole new tier of data services. As I had mentioned before, the ability to create snapshots and clones right down at the storage level, right alongside other highly performant storage systems that are available inside of the market. So when we look at what vSAN can do now, again, it's about how it's grown, how it's moved into deeper cycles of the customer's maturity trajectory. One key change inside of virtual SAN 6 is in the architectural availability. We now have 2 architectures available to us. We have our old familiar architecture, the hybrid architecture, wherein you would have a minimum of 1 solid state disk and 1 spinning disk. And that would create your disk group. And then you could scale that up and scale that out as needed in order to build out your cluster. And for those of you who don't remember, the purpose of the solid state disk inside of that hybrid group was to provide a read cache and a write buffer to everything else, which made virtual SAN perfect for things like VDI, cloud workloads, and it was also very quickly adopted for things like test and dev tier 2, tier 3 workloads very early on, because everybody wanted to see that work. And so now we're seeing that beyond just the standard hybrid architecture, that we also have the ability to adopt an all-flash solid-state drive architecture. This means that all of that cool functionality that was up there inside of the solid-state drive tier is now being boiled down throughout the entire virtual SAN array. It also means that we're going to have greater density, increased scale, and a whole heck of a lot more IOPS So let's go ahead and look at each one of these a little bit closer. The first is the hybrid architecture. And like I said, this is the architecture that we were always kind of familiar with and we've been dealing with for the past year or so. This is the one where you had at least one solid state and one spinning disk. Now, you could scale that up inside of those disk groups to have one solid state and up to 7 spinning disks. And that gave you a pretty good sized disk group. And then you could multiply that 5 more times inside of each host. You could then replicate that up to 32 hosts, now 64 with vSphere 6, and your IOPS would follow right along with it. Now we're seeing IOPS available at or around 40,000 IOPS per host. And it scales pretty straightforward. If you have a minimum of 3 hosts, which is the requirement for virtual SAN, then you're going to be looking at 120,000 IOPS inside of that vSAN cluster. If you scale greater, you'll get more IOPS. Add a 4th, you're at 160. Add a 5th, you're at 200. So this allows us a little more architectural freedom when we're talking about how we're going to align virtual SAN with the customer's needs and the overall workload. This also means that we can do things way beyond what is traditionally thought as capable. You know, I had an interesting call this past week and somebody said, you know, what would happen if the storage that was in the server was just way too big for VSAN to deal with? And so we started talking and we were wondering, you know, what are we talking about? You know, 6 terabyte, 8 terabyte, 10 terabyte drives? You know, they could possibly be that big. Well, after doing a little math, we were able to back into the idea that because of vSphere 6 and because of the functionality and capability that that's bringing to bear, that virtual SAN would theoretically be able to support up to 2.25 petabytes per individual host. Now, that would require some really significant storage, and that would also completely break hardware compatibility. But it's very exciting to think that the software-based technology is already there. It's already there waiting for us. All we have to do is align the hardware compatibility with it, and then we're going to really see a lot of change inside of the data center. So now, to take a look at the all-flash virtual SAN array. This is a really exciting idea, because now, instead of the flash being there just for read cache and write buffer, now the cache becomes 100% write. So it's able to function expediently throughout the storage stack. Additionally, we're looking at ridiculously high IOPS, up to 100,000 IOPS per host. Take that same idea we had a moment ago inside of the hybrid array, looking at 40,000 IOPS per host. And now we take that, you know, by another 1.5 times, and we're seeing some really dramatic amounts of density and some tremendous scale possibilities. Now, is this to say that I think that we're going to be deploying virtual SAN all-flash arrays out inside of every mid-market customer? Probably not today, but it is exciting to think that this technology is going to become more and more pedestrian, and we're going to see greater and greater adoption. And what we will have the capacity to do is when we're inside of our clients' boardrooms and they're bringing up different workloads and they're talking about what they're going to do about storage and this workload or that, and how they're going to parse the storage off to make it most effective. And then we're dealing and working with the storage administrators and virtual administrators and getting everybody to create a more cohesive vision together. Then we're going to be able to include things like all-flash virtual SAN arrays in the discussion. Because now, between the hybrid and the all-flash, there really isn't much we can't answer with virtual SAN. Everything from those tier 2, tier 3 workloads, test and dev, through tier 1 and business critical workloads, everywhere from small, medium business, mid-market, and the highest levels of enterprise, are going to be able to adopt and take advantage of the technology that Virtual SAN is bringing to the market. So there's always a lot of talk around Virtual SAN, especially with the conversations of scale. And everybody's quick to latch on to the idea of 64 nodes in a cluster. And while this is pretty impressive, we have to back up and say, when exactly are we going to be deploying 64 node clusters of Virtual SAN? Well, that might not necessarily happen today, but we are going to see it grow, and it definitely gives us some architectural freedom when we're talking about scale up versus scale out approaches, especially on the compute side. But there are a few other things that I think that have kind of flown under the radar with Virtual SAN that I wanted to bring to light today. One of them was the 62 terabyte VMDK. Now, this isn't to say we're going to go out and create monster machines right out of the gate, but I have been in a ton of situations where we might have been replicating a physical infrastructure into a virtual platform, or P2V if you will. And the drives and what that workload was dependent on was maybe just a little bit too big for the current constraints. And so we're seeing these increases between vSphere 6 and VSAN, giving us greater capacity, not necessarily just to create monster VMs, but just to suit those machines that are just too big for what we were capable of doing before. This goes back to kind of, in my opinion, VMware's overarching message, which is leverage existing investments, extend the ecosystem, and to be able to integrate with everything else inside of the data center. And so if we talk about now being able to really faithfully and truthfully replicate what's going on out there inside of the physical world, in the virtual world, the ability to provide those 62 terabyte VMDKs is definitely going to help us get there. Additionally, we see now that we have up to 32 snapshots per virtual machine. And this kind of, raises an interesting point. Years back when I was a VM admin, we had a case wherein we were doing a ton of development. The developers were using snapshots pretty much the exact way you should use them. They were going in, creating code, running a snapshot, and then testing, going back, doing another snapshot, and progressing through. Now, because the depth of the snapshots were so deep, I walked in one day to find out that the original virtual machine could no longer be found because the snapshot tree had gotten so deep that the trail of breadcrumbs going into the forest just simply could not find the original virtual machine anymore. And that was obviously a real heartbreaking day. Now, fast forward to where we are today, we see that we have the capacity for up to 32 snapshots per virtual machine. This is an exciting idea because it once again underlines vSAN's capacity and vSphere's capacity to adapt to all new types of workloads inside of the virtual data center and with the brave new IT that's being pushed out.